So I'm Kirsten, I'm actually Rob's colleague at the University of Westminster. So my research focus is sort of automatic mixing based. I did a PhD to do with clarity in the mix process. Now I'm mostly interested in sort of vocal clarity. It's quite fascinating. So what I'll do now is I'll just kind of give you a bit of an overview, an introduction to the field of automatic mixing, because I'm aware that we all have sort of quite different backgrounds here. Then I'm going to sort of offer some scientific and creative perspectives as to what vocal clarity in a mix might depend on. And I actually did a listening test, an experiment. That's why it gets a little bit more technical, but I'll try my best to sort of explain it in a way that makes sense to everyone, and obviously the findings from that. So first of all, the field of automatic mixing. So basically, if I look at a tool such as this, right, and I might not be the most experienced producer or mix engineer in the world, I might look at something like this and go, oh, you know, I want my music to sound more bright or more punchy or more sparkly or fat, warm, balanced, you know, whatever. How the hell can I get these different buttons to do that for me? And, you know, especially for a novice user, that can be really confusing because there's like no punchiness button on here. So I guess overall the idea is to work out how mix parameters actually relate to perceptual parameters. Like there's some sort of translation has to take place first. And a lot of the tools that we use nowadays are still kind of based on the physicalities of tools that we might have used in the past. So, you know, but now we have the ability to make, you know, quite interesting plugins, and we can actually create automatic mix plugins. So what we're trying to do in this field in general is I guess, to bridge the gap between how we're thinking and how these tools work. And as a result, to hopefully allow greater control over the outcome, you know, or if anything, to just sort of offer an alternative to the tools that we have, you know, because the tools can influence the creative output, obviously. So I've already mentioned that amateur mix engineers benefit from this, because they can, if they have an automatic tool for, say, punchiness or clarity, then they can manipulate the perceptual parameters without having to make kind of without having to have complex knowledge of the audio signal. So they can just go, I want this to be brighter. But also for professionals it can be useful, because then they might be able to sort of concentrate on high level creative decision making and maybe just sort of change things up a little bit. So there's a lot of application for this stuff. Like if you look at cameras, there's like auto contrast, auto focus, red eye correction. There's all these different things, but when it comes to music mixing, there's not that much out there that can do these sort of things. So the idea is to sort of work towards that a little bit. And also, I mean, science and creativity kind of should complement each other in sort of getting closer to that, and that's, I guess, what I'm trying to do as well. So the thing that I like to focus on is vocal clarity, just because it's one of the most important parameters of music mixes. Like most songs or most pieces that you hear on the radio are going to have some kind of vocal in them. So trying to work out what makes vocals clear is certainly would be really useful. And if I look at various different mix engineers, you know, they all at some point or another mention that vocal clarity is really important. It's just a few examples there. I'm not going to read them all out. So now the thing is, like, how do we start in terms of like methodology? So there's various different research areas that we can tap into. At the moment, there's unfortunately no proven basis as to what makes recorded singing clear, or what vocal mix clarity is, or like even in general what makes vocals clear. Like if we don't even look at mixing but just vocals in general, there's like no clarity index or something like that. So there's various different research areas. That's kind of the areas that I was looking at a lot in my PhD when I was looking at generally sort of sound clarity. That can be useful, like clarity in the psychoacoustics or audio engineering world has been really heavily been assessed in concert halls, and it relates quite a lot to spatial clarity in that case, which is maybe not 100% what we're trying to do here, but because it's such a big field, it can be useful in informing what we're trying to find out. Then there's speech intelligibility, which is also a really big field, trying to work out when speech is clear. And it's quite possible that relates to when vocals are clear. Then there's timbral clarity, like timbre research, timbre research focuses on like all sorts of things, like when does something sound warm, bright, sharp, hard or soft, and to try and work out some sort of physical parameters that relate to that. Then loudness, because arguably if something's louder then we can hear it better, and so it might be clearer. Then masking is quite important, because if an element in a mix is masked, we're not going to be able to hear all of it. It might be partially masked, and that means that it's not going to be as clear. And lastly, this might not be something that, not everyone might have heard of this. There's a field called auditory scene analysis, which is basically looks at how your auditory system interprets the complex waveform that goes into your ears. Like, basically, it's like looking through a tube at the water level in the lake. Like, that's what happens in the ears. Like, you look into this tube and the water level goes up and down. And from that little information, you can tell how many ships are in the lake, how big the lake is, whether there's people around. Basically, auditory scene analysis does something similar to that for sound. So trying to work out how the auditory system breaks down all that stuff into different units. So those are some areas that are worth looking at. Like I said before, I kind of looked at sounds in general. For clarity, the high and low frequency ratio seems important. It's important that there's no annoying resonances, but that can get quite complicated because sometimes resonances are good and sometimes they're not good, so it kind of depends on whether they're part of the natural character of the sound or not. But one thing that has really came out from all of this, from looking at all these areas, is that it's always sort of the spectral parameters that are mentioned across all of these research areas. So it seems that EQ must be particularly important for making vocals sound clearer. So then I decided to just sort of narrow it down to that. And now obviously there's also the creative context, so this might be more difficult to generalize. So this, the style of the song, fashion, etc. I'm going to quote you here. So, I remember chatting to you about how you mix vocals, and you were saying that, each artist has a slightly different mix, and, the way that you bring up their characteristic spectrum can be different. So that might be something that's difficult to generalize. Even when it comes to something as simple as vocal loudness, there's disagreement. This study says that vocals are always, usually set to a similar loudness as the rest of the mix. But then, on the other hand, others say that it really depends on the context again. Also, Zagorski-Thomas, sound of recordings has kind of changed over time, and so on. So that the exaggeration of intimacy of the fashion trend. So there's a lot of sort of context-dependent stuff. But if a computer isn't going to understand that, because the computer doesn't know what fashion or trend means unless you have some sort of mathematical algorithm to tell it that. By the way, just to go back to the automatic mixing part, it can range from actually trying to get the whole mix mixed for you automatically to just giving you better control over stuff, so that you're still adjusting it yourself. So the automatic part is not necessarily that it's mixing for you, but just that it automates some of the stuff that might make it a little bit more inconvenient. So in terms of vocal quality, there's some research on vocal quality that I found, but a lot of this, there's not really sort of a lot of commonality between these findings, except that they're, again, all spectrum related. Let's go through this. So the formats around sort of 2.5 to 3.5 kilohertz really determined voice type and quality, according to this study. Then the 3 kilohertz area being really indicative of how well trained the singer is. Then we have 2 to 4 kilohertz and 0 to 2 kilohertz is important for measuring classical voice quality, but only for the vowel A. So a lot of this is very, very specific. Like, then we have like a study on edginess, like what makes vocals sound edgy, richness and depth, and so on. So there's like lots of small little studies that have related different frequency areas to different like traits in the vocal. But what's also important is kind of parameters that relate to song key and harmonic structure. Then the vocal like level, pitch, musical articulation, all that stuff can be important. Then like the noise to harmonic ratio, I suppose that feeds into like speech intelligibility in a way that, if you've got too much noise, you don't want to really be able to understand like the lyrics or hear the melody so well. But basically, like, what this does have in common is all about sort of the amount of energy in different frequency areas, but also kind of maybe the level of different harmonics and formats, factors relating to song key, noise and tonal components. So it does make sense already to maybe have a tool that picks out those different elements and has buttons that kind of turn those things up and down maybe. Right, so I basically did an experiment where I tried to squeeze in as much of that stuff as possible. And I just tried to go through this in the time that I have. So I did like a multiple stimulus comparison test, which is basically just a test where people compare lots of different stimuli. I'll show you in a picture in a minute. And people rated the clarity of vocal stimuli inside noise. And I had 6 program items, these. Basically, program items being the recordings that I used. And for each of them, I had 17 different EQ'd versions. And just to go through them, so we have like basically some female, all of them were just one note, because I wanted to kind of reduce the complexity as much as possible to find out which things are most likely to influence vocal clarity, and to have as little variation over time as possible. So it's quite sterile and quite clinical at this point. But I hope to maybe build on from that and combine factors together. So we have some female and some male ones. Some are kind of sung in like a twangy like way. Others, like we have one soft one, the male one. Then some high, some low, like basically an octave apart. Like there was some 200 hertz, some 400 hertz ones. And sometimes I use the vowel A and sometimes the vowel E, because I want to find out if there's actually like a difference between different vowels. So yeah, this is kind of what I already just said. Like these are basically the things that differed between the stimuli to try and work out what might be important. So this is the noise that I use, the spectrum of the noise, which are based on a study by Pastana et al., which say that generally this is roughly sort of the shape that professionally recorded commercial recordings have, like on average. So rather than just using like pink noise or white noise, I try to use kind of a sort of noise that's the most similar to a recording. Obviously this would normally be the recording plus the vocal, but like this was the closest I could get to something like realistic-ish. Right, so then I had 1 EQ treatment per stimulus, and I put in some boosts and cuts on the fundamental, on the first 4 harmonics at 3 kilohertz, 5 kilohertz, 10 kilohertz. And I had basically another independent researcher adjust these boosts and cuts to all have sort of the same perceptual strength, because like just doing 9 decibel for all of them made it really hard to hear in like the higher frequency areas. Whereas if I applied 24 decibels of boosts and cuts, sometimes that would be like incredibly loud. So I just was trying to get like a level of perceptual similarity, I suppose. Loudness matched them all. Generally I just try to have not too many stimuli, but still like enough variation in things. So this is what the listening test page looked like. This is just a Maximus P patch. So you had all the stimuli at the top. You could play them and then adjust like a slider to how clear you thought they were, and then press the sort button and it would arrange them by like whichever order you had them in at that point. So it's quite a lot on one page, but it did give me a lot to look at. So I'll go into the results quickly. I think I've got about 5 minutes. I'll just explain what this plot is. So this is basically like a line plot, so that what we can see here is basically on the left here, that's clarity, so how clear stimulus was rated to be. Then all the dots are the median, so like the average rating. And this is like a confidence interval, so that means basically statistics say if I was to run this listening test 100 times, which I'm not going to do, in about 95% of cases, the average is going to sit somewhere on that line. What we can see, and then here at the bottom is I actually arranged them by sort of harmonics. So this is the fundamental boost, fundamental cut, first harmonic boost, first harmonic cut, and then from this point onwards I did it in kilohertz, because at that point the harmonics are so close together that it's pointless to do it that way. What we can see basically is that basically the boosts seem to contribute kind of negatively, more negatively than the cuts to clarity, all the way up to sort of this point, and then it flips around. Another thing that we can see is that the cuts are all sort of on a similar line, so they don't seem to make such a big difference as the boosts did. And another thing we can see is that the sort of confidence interval here, like around the fundamental, is a little bit larger, like the boost and the cut are nearly sort of overlapping. So it seems that there's something going on with the fundamental. There's like a switchover point around 3 kilohertz. And then what I did next was to kind of look at the different points that I mentioned earlier separately. So in this plot I'm comparing the high and low stimuli for the same frequency areas. Not all of them are on here because I boosted and cut different harmonics. Not all the frequency areas were the same for both, if that makes any sense. So what we can see here is that they behave pretty similarly, but around the fundamental there's a difference, because for the high stimuli this is the fundamental, whereas for the low stimuli the fundamental is lower. So we can see that when a frequency area is around the fundamental, then the boosts and the cuts didn't really differ from each other as much as in all other frequency areas. Hope that made sense. So the fundamental, basically what we can say to sum up, is the fundamental is somehow different to other areas. Then I compared the vowels, and there's quite a big difference here, around 3 kilohertz. Other than that, they're similar. So the red is vowel A, the blue is vowel E. And again, they behave somewhat similarly, except from that area, which kind of makes sense because that's where they differ spectrally. And so it does actually seem that as the spectrum of the voice changes over time, it makes sense for an EQ to kind of adapt to what it's doing over time and not to just have the same thing on everything. Then what did I compare here? So we have the female versus the male. So again, there's kind of a difference in this area. Could be to do with the fact that obviously the female and male had different spectra. Oh, I'm gonna go around, gosh. Too much stuff, but basically, right, I'll go through this a little bit more quickly now. But basically, to sum up everything that I've said so far, is the fundamental seems to differ. There's something at 3 kilohertz area, the vowels make a difference, and so on. So I just applied some sort of models to find out what might predict clarity. And I looked at the spectral centroid, which is like a weighted central mass of energy of a spectrum. I always explain it with a broom for some reason. So like if you imagine we're balancing like a piece of wood or something, then this is like the center of mass of it. So if the same would be the case if this was a spectrum. So these are your lows and these are your highs. If I was to add energy here, then it would go down. If I was to add energy there, it would go up. So it's like a weighted center of mass of energy. We'll skip this because we'll skip that as well. So the harmonic centroid is basically the spectral centroid divided by the harmonic. So it's basically what harmonic does the central mass of energy of a spectrum sit on. And the higher that is, the clearer it is going to be. So that was the case for my listening test. So you can see kind of that there's a line where it goes up. The higher that the harmonic centroid is, the greater clarity is. And what we can see here is that actually I plotted boosts and cuts separately, and the cuts were the red ones, and it turns out that they just didn't move this harmonic centroid far enough, maybe for clarity to change. Then another thing I looked at was, God, I made this too long, was I looked at the vocal backing, the vocal to backing track ratio. So I applied like a sort of a masking model to see how much of the vocal was masked. And, you know, as you might expect, the less masked that it was, the clearer it was. So that was a masking model, which was also quite useful. Too much. So I'm just going to make some suggestions for what an automatic EQ tool might do. Like an automatic clarity tool, I should say. So it seems that some sort of spectral tool, EQ, that was similar would be good for sort of automatically adjusting clarity. It should should allow the user to make some context-dependent adjustments. So give the user some control to kind of do tweaks themselves, because there might not be something that fits everything. But it would make sense for it to kind of follow peaks and harmonics, and especially sort of the fundamental, as there was like the most disagreement as to whether it should be turned up or down. So follow the peaks, maybe also follow kind of how large peaks are, and adjust sort of the gain accordingly over time. And so maybe you would just have some buttons that allow you to tweak how high each peak is in general, and then track the peak height as it goes up and down. Maybe there'd be some kind of special focus on the fundamental and the 3 kilohertz area, because that came up both like in the literature. It was mentioned by some people, and it seemed to be important here as well. So it might be good for people to adjust those. Like the fundamental obviously is different all the time, so if it could automatically track that, that would be good. And of course, measure the vocal to backing track ratio, like how much masking is going on, and take that into consideration. It might also be interesting to see if like some of this has some sort of implications for being able to sing more clearly. It's just another thought at the end, but I'll stop there before I keep going on and on.
Fascinating. Really, really interesting. Any questions?
Kirsten, have you looked at any of the kind of commercially available vocal chain software packages, like some of the Waves ones, producer packs, and to kind of unpack what they're doing?
Yeah, so I mean, there's things like isotope plugins, like Neutron, things like that already look at automatically detecting where peaks are and letting you adjust them. So those kinds of things are, definitely something that's great to build on. Yeah.
I think the best one I've found is Soothe,
Which
is really great for vocals, and that's the only one that I found that I hate most of those automatic tools. I struggle with them because they're absolutely brilliant when they work, but I tend to find that they don't. But Soothe is really good for vocals.
Fair enough, okay.
Yeah, and the other thing I was thinking, I've yet to see a tool that suggests mirrored EQ moves. Like, would that be an area where it would make cuts to material that's masking the vocals at certain points?
Isotope does that. Neutron does masking.
Yeah.
Does it make suggestions to what?
I think it's got some sort of visual information.
It does, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. It's definitely, I agree that it's definitely important to look at the backing track and vocal interaction, definitely.
I'm with you on Soothe as well. It's because Soothe, it's constantly moving. It's like having a dynamic EQ with
It's like a dynamic multi-band compressor, really.
Yeah, but like with 200 bands. So it's not, and it's constantly moving. So it follows vocal pitch, which you were talking about as well, which is, but it really only deals with mid-range.
Sorry,
as well. With mid-range.
Mid and top.
200, mid-range, top end. That's true. Be interesting to see something that goes down further.
Yeah.
but like the waves, vocal rider and stuff like that, they just sound natural to me. But so I think your areas were really interesting. I think there's a lot of relevance and openings within them.
Yeah, I mean, it's a new area. There's still, a lot of development has to happen still.
This isn't so much a question as just as a thinking point. But for me, clarity was not something I was ever kind of specifically going for when I mix vocals. It's more kind of warmth and presence and the body in the voice.
Yeah.
And sometimes here in kind of in a cafe, you hear some Chet Baker on the system. You think, wow, his voice sounds so clear and present, and yet it hasn't got any of the brightness that we naturally can wind into songs and into vocals. And so it's I think it's a balance between clarity, which is often high-end information, and warmth and chest resonance, and that's the dynamic that you're kind of riding here. Essentially, it's the sense that the singer is, it's program specific, but often the singer's close to you and the real person and the tactile qualities.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's not about making everything as clear as possible. It's more about saying clarity seems to be important, and therefore controls that can adjust it would be useful, like either to turn it up or down, and then maybe if you can make more tools for warmth and all these other things, and then incorporate them as well. That just gives you an idea of how vastly complicated it can get. But
And then you've got the back, you get some harmonically distorted guitars and try and set a vocal over there, and it's like you're saying, it's all about the 3K and the 8 to 10, and because it's got to cut through.
Yeah.
So, but I agree with you, listen to Chet Baker or
Nick Drake.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's you can hear it, the warmth, and Ella Fitzgerald, all of those. You get the texture of the voice, but I think
The program material is very broad,
very light, not sort of heavily masculine.
I think you can't discount the idea of microphone selection here as well. I think about which, I'm sure there are plenty of engineers in here. I would probably set 4 or 5 microphones up and listen to them in context.
Yeah.
That would be my starting point.
So
you use the good one. Yeah.
I agree. I think that's a good point. So I suppose the idea with a lot of kind of psychoacoustic or like psychoacoustic engineering type research is to find out what makes stuff clear or warm or bright, whatever you're trying to find out in terms of like the spectrum. And then as a second step, you can either achieve that through mixing or through microphone choice. But as long as you know what the blueprint of clarity is, then that could come either from the singing technique, from the room you're in. It could come from a lot of different things. But by measuring the spectrum, you can then look at it and say this seems to be clear. Yeah, you could definitely look at microphones. One of my colleagues, who's at Surrey, he's actually looking specifically at microphones and how when microphones sound clear, bright, etc. Yeah.
The University of Huddersfield, inspiring tomorrow's professionals.